Hello and welcome to the Booktopia podcast. I'm Ben Hunter, Booktopia's fiction category manager. Today, I'm recording outside. If it's a little bit noisy, you'll know why. They're renovating the house above mine, or the flat above mine. So I'm outside. It's a bit strange, but I'm thrilled to be here because I'm on the line with Amor Towles. He's a Boston-born New York writer who has sold more than 4 million copies of his books, The Rules of Civility and A Gentleman in Moscow. His new book is called The Lincoln Highway, and I'm really wrapped in it. Amor, thank you so much for your time today.
Good to be here, Ben. Thanks so much for having me on Booktopia.
From what I understand, The Lincoln Highway is really quite a different book to what you've written previously. It's a wild adventure that takes you across America in the 1950s, and it's told from multiple perspectives. How would you describe this one, particularly for so many fans that you've picked up off the wild success of A Gentleman in Moscow?
You're absolutely right about the fact that the two books stand in contrast to each other. And for me, that's a very natural outcome as an artist. Because for those of your listeners who have read A Gentleman in Moscow, they know that that book follows an aristocrat from the age of 30 to 60 who is under house arrest in Moscow. And that book begins, on page 1, he walks into the Hotel Metropole in Moscow and he doesn't come out. It's 30 years in the hotel. So as I was deciding what I'm going to do next, and I've been writing fiction my whole life, and I have many ideas I'd like to tackle, I think it's very natural that all my instincts were to do something different than what I had just spent 5 years doing. So I wanted to get out of the building. And I also was interested in doing something that wasn't a span of 30 years. And so I had this notion dating back many years ago of a young man, 18-year-old, who actually had killed someone by mistake in a fight that he had not started. And was sent for a year in a juvenile sort of work camp. And I had this vision of him being driven home the day that he had finished his term to the family farm in the Midwest in Nebraska. And the warden saying, this was a freak accident and you're a good person and you've paid your debt to society, go start your life anew. And it turned out that 2 of his friends from the juvenile prison, as it were, had hidden in the trunk of the warden's car. That was kind of the idea that I had. And I always envisioned that this story, if it was told, would be very rapid. It would be over 10 days. And so as I was leaving the realm of A Gentleman in Moscow, this aristocratic, trapped in this beautiful hotel in this troubled, 3 decades of Russian history, I was suddenly, it's like, I'm going to go do the trunk of the car story, because not only because do I get to do with 18-year-olds, which is a very different kind of story. I'll be back in America in a time period that's of interest to me, the 50s, but also it'll be this 10-day period. And that's a big difference in storytelling, to shift from 30 years to 10 days. And so that makes it exciting for me. So I get to retool all the aspects of my craft. I get to give the reader a very different experience. John Moscow will be a fan of Lincoln Highway. I'm confident of that. But at the same time, will be a different experience.
Yeah, he's certainly not getting the same thing twice. Tell me about this period. Like, what would it be like for a young man coming off a farm in Nebraska in this time frame that's disappearing from living memory? It is post-war, pre-Vietnam America, where like civil rights and the sexual revolution are just about to hit. It's like the cusp of a new kind of the second half of the 20th century, isn't it?
That's exactly it, Ben. So, and that's kind of one of the things that attracts me to it, is that it was an oasis as a decade in 50 years of turbulence, because you have the Depression is the entire 30s. The Second World War is the first half of the 40s. The Korean War follows very quickly in the United States. And the GIs are just coming back and getting their lives going at the end of the 40s. And so the 50s, the Korean War ends in 1953. The economy is in good shape. All the GIs have gone back and have been sent to college under the GI Bill and have now are in the workforce. The suburbs are booming. American brands are booming, but it's a period of relative cultural quiet in many ways, as you say, because of all these things that are just under the surface but about to happen. The ones you mentioned. The Vietnam War is coming in the 60s. The sexual revolution kind of is just about to begin because Playboy, which I assume your listeners will know what that is, but Hugh Hefner invents the notion of classy pornography, right? Which is that for 100 years, men and some women who wanted to see nudity would go to an alley and buy it in a paper bag, and suddenly Hugh Hefner was like, enough of that. I'm going to create a magazine with beautiful pictures of beautiful women who are naked. And there's going to be interviews with authors and presidents. And there's going to be articles on, travel in Europe. And you're going to want to put that magazine on the coffee table. That was kind of his idea. And that happened, so that's just about to happen. Television in the United States was launched a few years before, but it's over the course of the decade that it really unfolds. And so by the end of the decade, it'll be in 90% of the households in America. So that's sort of beginning. Rock and roll is invented in 1954 in the United States. And so that's about to happen. And the other major one you mentioned is the civil rights movement. And, for your Australian listeners, the major event in 1954 was something called Brown versus the Board of Education. This was a Supreme Court decision, which for decades, the South in America had said separate but equal is okay. So meaning you can have white students in one building, black students in another, as long as they're both being taught, that is okay. And the Supreme Court says that is not okay. There's no such thing as separate but equal. And desegregation begins, and suddenly, Rosa Parks emerges, Martin Luther King emerges, and all that's about to happen, like literally within a year of 1954. So this moment in time is sort of a great sort of quiet moment where a whole generation is about to come of age, just as American culture is going to be turned upside down.
And your central character that kind of anchors this story, he's, as you say, he's just done a stint for involuntary manslaughter. He's taken a life. It's a really serious thing, but equally weighing on him is his his father has just died, and he's kind of known in town, the father, as having been a failure, has sort of made a failure of his farm and his land, and the house is going to be repossessed. And at the very outset of this novel, as this guy goes around town, this young guy, it strikes me as really odd, as he has this huge piece of baggage in his really young life. He's taken a life, but that might not be the biggest part of his baggage. It's the his mother has gone as well. She's kind of just fled, and he's left with his brilliant younger brother Billy, who I'd love you to talk about as well. But something about creating that kind of contrast in your young character in what is actually like a really light and joyous novel.
Yeah, I think the best way for me to talk about it is, I'm not giving anything away. As I mentioned, Emmett, who you're talking about, is a very honorable young guy. He's made this terrible mistake, and he feels the weight of it quite intensely. As you say, his father was a failure and has died, so he also feels the weight of it's time. He's going to need to take care of his brother now, and sort of they're going to have to go figure out where to live and everything. Meanwhile, you have these two guys in the car, and they're both 18 too. One is from New York. They're both from New York, but from the opposite ends of the cultural spectrum. One is the child of a failed sort of vaudevillian actor / con man who kind of lived hand to mouth in the city, fast talking New Yorker type. The other one was sort of an aristocrat, or descended from the aristocratic New York, and went to private schools, and has traveled the world a little bit even as a young man. So you have this triumvirate of these three friends who the story begins with. And I think that in retrospect, I didn't set out to do this, but in retrospect, and of course, this is what happens, is the story is very much about how at the age of 18, we fashion ourselves. If you think about our lives, and this is true, throughout the world, you take the kid who's from 1 year old to 14 years old or whatever, everybody is feeding that young person information about how they should live their life. You know, the parents are, the church is, the school is, the community is, the books they read are all meant to sort of help shape that young person, and which you sort of just take. But suddenly, like around 18, that it turns around where suddenly it's your job to now do it yourself. And you have kind of both the right and the responsibility to do it. And to some degree, that's a filtering of a sifting of all this stuff you've been given. Is what of it are you going to keep and what are you going to toss out as you fashion your own future, you know, and decide who you're going to be, you know, forgetting whatever your parents were. And some kids want to be just like their dad, and some kids don't want to be the opposite of their dad. You know, some kids, you know, embrace religion. Some kids are like, I will never go to church again in my life. And so but that's when it's happening, is at that point in time. So the book, even though it only takes place over 10 days, it is a window on the beginning of these 3 young men and 1 young woman who are all in the very first stages of trying to figure out who are they going to be? What do they want from life? What do they aspire to? What is their ethos? What are they willing to do? What are they unwilling to do? You know, what is right and wrong? All that has to be sort of fashioned just for all of us. You know, we all are figuring that out at that moment. And the decisions we kind of make in that short multi-year period can influence the rest of our lives. Are we a person who's willing to lie? You know, we kind of decide then. And it's, you know, you can bet that if you're a liar at 18, you're probably a liar at 55, you know, and vice versa, right? If you're a person who's dedicated to honesty as a young person, you're probably going to be dedicated to honesty later. And so, and you may have good reasons for which one of those things you choose. So Emmett does have weight. Willie has a different kind of weight. Duchess has a different kind of weight. But they're all in the business of about to fashion themselves out of the raw material of what's been given them.
Tell me about Duchess and his firstly how he comes to have the name Duchess and his very strange and peculiar moral compass, because it is a very sturdy moral compass, but it looks very strange from the outside, doesn't it?
Yes. It is, you know. So I can't remember. Where are you located right now? Where are you?
I'm outside in a park in Sydney.
What, in Sydney, right? You're in Sydney. So I can't remember. You know, does Sydney have the equivalent of like the downtown New York? You know, where troublemakers thrive? You know, I mean, what, you know, where is that in Australia? There must be that spot where you have the urban fast talkers and the con men and the the charmers and the big dreamers, and you know, where is that in Australia?
Yeah, there's a lot of old neighborhoods, but again, like both Sydney and Melbourne, the 2 really big cities, are changing very quickly, and sort of suburban sprawl is happening very quickly, and gentrification is happening very quickly, as it is, I'm sure, in places like LA and New York. So it's a rapidly changing thing that areas like Surrey Hills used to be the haunt of gangsters and such, but
right.
And that's right downtown near Central Station in Sydney. Yeah. But right now that's upmarket cafes and hairdressers, and you know what I mean.
My point being, that's where Duchess came from, right? Before the gentrification, right? Where because New York City, in a sort of an extreme version of what Sydney has been through, or a part of Sydney's development is, New York City took people in from around the world in the 1880s, the 1890s, and 1900s. So by the time you get to the Second World War, half of the population are people who've come from somewhere else, and or the children who come from somewhere else, and it's a rough and tumble environment, and so people. Hustle exists. It's built into the lower New York City mindset. As wherever you're from, you're trying to survive, and within kind of roughly within the bounds of the law. And some people like the mob, just say to hell with the law. But everybody else is trying to get by making something cheaper, selling something faster, being charming if it's necessary, whatever. And so Duchess is raised out of that environment. And as you say, that there is a moral compass to Duchess, as there is to anybody who kind of grows up in those environments, but it is a different moral compass than the kid in the suburbs, who goes to church on Sunday and whose, dad is the coach of the baseball team, right? The moral compass there is more nuanced, as it were. And it may be, a little bit more, well, if that guy took, money from me, then, it's totally reasonable for me to take the money back from him, in a different way. And, and I am, it's within my rights to do it. And that's the appropriate thing in the grand scheme of things to have, that score settled, and that's the kind of guy Duchess is, which is that he believes in that a score should be settled. And so when he does something wrong, he thinks he owes the other person some kind of retribution, so that or that mean that he has to pay them in some way to settle the score. But if somebody wrongs him, he feels it is completely moral for him to exact some kind of punishment from them, whatever that's financial or physical, you name it. And so there's a moral code in there, but it is the moral code of the tough neighborhood, as opposed to the moral code of gentrification.
Yeah, and it's very interesting things will happen to a young man who'll go out of his way to take a punch when he feels he needs to.
That's right. That's part of
it. Yeah. Ava, I've been savoring this novel for a good number of days now. It's been a wonderful kind of bedtime story novel, and I read passages aloud to my partner as she nods off to sleep at night. That's been a really rich experience. And I think it's because this story of adventure is layered together with so many different kind of vignettes or delightful detours from what you think is going to be the core action of the novel. A favorite that comes to mind is the story of a guy called Townhouse, who is a former inmate from Harlem who Duchess pays a visit to. Did you plan all these kind of detours into your writing, or did they just kind of blossom out of creating this thing?
I am an outliner, so
right,
and a planner. So for me, typically, I have an idea for a book. It interests me. I'll start to think about it and dwell on it and imagine it in greater and greater detail. I have notebooks, dedicated to individual ideas that will accumulate over time a more detailed picture of that book before I ever sit down to write it. And that's a multi-year process for me. I call it the design phase. And so by the time I sit down to write a chapter one, I usually know 90% of what's going to happen in the book, at least to some degree. Now, along the way, in the writing process, new things will present themselves. So, one of the sort of side stories, which it was one of the first things I thought of. I don't even know why. In one of the side stories in the book is about a guy named Fitzy. You may not have reached that yet, but where the notion is this: Fitzy is back in like the 40s, and Fitzy is a low level vaudevillian actor, and he loves Walt Whitman, the American poet who had a big white beard. So he grows a big white beard, and he convinces people to put him on stage for an anniversary of Whitman's birth or whatever. And it's a big phenomenon. And he, reads Whitman's poetry and, but dressed like Whitman, looking like Whitman. And everybody wants him. He gets rich. He starts to get rich off of this. And, I've been a guy who's been down and out. And at one of these events, a society woman says, "Hey, with your white beard, you'd be perfect for Santa Claus. Would you be Santa at my fancy uptown party?" And so he goes and he does that. And he gets even more rich from that, because over the course of the winter, December, all the richest families in New York want this guy to be their Santa Claus. And he's doing 3 gigs a night. And he's $1,000 a night at Christmas time. And then so he works in December and doesn't have to work any time of the year. He's getting richer and richer. And at one of these Christmas parties, a young woman says, "Hey, I'm a part of the Greenwich Village, Labor Society. And we would love to have you come and speak on the May Day gathering, because with your beard, you look just like Karl Marx."
Karl Marx.
And so he does. He goes, and it's a disaster because the police raid the joint and his photograph is in the newspaper. And so his life of being a Santa is over now that he's known as a commie provocateur. So I know. So like this story, which is like 3 pages in the book, and the guy's not even in the book, but it's a part of the world of that Duchess has come from. It's an old friend of his father's who's now a drunk. And where did that come from? That's the kind of thing, like I was wandering around one day and I think I thought about Whitman and Santa looking similar. And then I was like, so does Karl Marx. And I was like, what if a guy, and then you sort of imagine this story. And then I was like, you know what? This is perfect because this would be the guy who'd be a friend of Duchess's father. So it gets tucked into the outline of this thing. The story you're talking about, which is Townhouse, how Townhouse gets in trouble. That I did not have in my mind until I got there. I kind of knew that Townhouse did something that, obviously he did something that get him sent to this facility. And I kind of knew the kind of guy he was, that he and Emmett would get along. And they, even though from a different race, a different part of the country, that they would be similar, of like mind, but I didn't know what he had done. And I kind of got to that point where I was writing it. And then you have to sort of, it kind of, hopefully it comes to you, you know what I mean? Without much fretting, of, oh, right. What he's going to do is, what's going to have happened to him is, and then you get this story that I had this notion of these guys, these young guys who work for their father, taking dents out of cars, and they close the body shop on Saturday for their father. And they realize, well, shit, the cars work and dad's at home. We could rent these cars out, the clients' cars, for, $10 an hour to our friends who want to go on dates. And so they kind of launched this secret business. And young Townhouse, 16, 17, he rents, a fancy Cadillac in Harlem, takes a girl out and gets caught, and, doesn't want to turn into his friends. So he ends up getting, busted for grand theft auto, of all things, as a minor. But yeah, so that kind of came out as I was literally writing the chapter, is sort of this notion. So some of those things are built in very tight into the story, and some of them kind of flourish out. I knew, if you get farther at the end of the story, the two guys who fix cars, they were already in the story, because it becomes critical to have them, because Emmett, the hero, has a car and they need to do some work on that car. So they were already in the story. So then it made a nice sense to kind of bring their job into the Townhouse story and have the two things merge. That's sort of the way it works for me.
Yeah, there's so there's so much joy to find, just in a few short pages of this book. And I can only imagine, were there a lot of these glorious little gem stories that you had to leave behind to make the final book work? And does that pain you as a writer?
No, I'm always willing to take something out. It is a game of balance, and you're trying to, as one aspect of the story is, like Fitzy, who's this old friend of Duchess's father, this, in this low rundown performing group of, performers who are kind of losers and drunks and gamblers. There were multiple stories from Duchess's world, so you can get a sense of what he was raised in. But I had more of those than I could use, as you say. So at a certain point, you're like, there's two, you can feel it. There's one too many, or there's two too many, and so you have to pull out this, I love this anecdote about this guy or this magician or whatever he is, and, this sleight of hand artist. And you deciding, I had this whole thing written, which I'm going to give to you, Ben. This is for you, so you can have this.
Yes.
So the notion was, his father was going to run a scam where he plays. He's a mentalist, where you go to a theater and you look out at the audience and you predict, or you have insights into the individual people in the audience. And his scam is that he's sleeping with the girl who runs the coat room at the fancy restaurant across the street from the theater. And so, everybody comes to that restaurant before the show. And so he has her going through the jackets of all the people that are, at the restaurant. So he's got all this information when the show begins, but eventually they get busted. So I was like, so you have that kind of thing that gets pulled out eventually, because you're like, I have too many of these kinds of things in the book, because it is, I say, it's this sort of, you have to have a feel for, when am I overdoing this? When is I underdoing it? And you have to kind of try to hit that moment of equilibrium. And yes, sometimes that means you love this little bit, but out it goes, You'll
have to do a deleted scenes.
Yeah, right. The extended DVD. Yes.
Yeah. There's more characters we haven't even touched on in what we've chatted about thus far. One of the few women in the story is Sally, and she is she is the unlikely source of so much of the comedy in this book.
Yes.
Who's Sally and what makes her tick?
So, and sort of as a quick background for your listeners, this book, when I originally envisioned, it's a 10-day story, as I said. And when I originally envisioned it, it was going to be told from two perspectives. You'd hear Emmett's perspective and Duchess's perspective, the two characters we've talked about. Every day, you kind of get their version of events or back to back or whatever, and the story would move forward that way. Now, when I got deep into the book, there's a sequence on a train where two guys show up on this train where the young Billy is alone in a boxcar, and a guy named Pastor John and a character named Ulysses, who's an African-American veteran. And I could hear these two characters so strongly that I wrote the sequence of Pastor John's arrival from his perspective, and then I wrote the Ulysses's arrival from his perspective. And suddenly it's like the cat out of the bag.
Floodgates are open.
Yeah. Oh my God. So then I was like, well, wait, if I'm not going to do just Emmett and Duchess back and forth, I'm going to include these guys. Then what about Sally? That was the first thing I said to myself, because she appears early in the book. And even through interaction, Emmett talking to her or Duchess talking to her, I know who she is, and her personality is so strong, and she's kind of hilarious in her way. And so I was like, I want to have Sally have her own chapter. So I went back and added Sally chapters, and then she, has chapters throughout the book. Same thing with Wooly. I knew Wooly, who's the third guy from the juveniles camp. I knew him. He's this beautiful sort of soul. And I knew what he was thinking and how he was sounding, but it didn't really come across in the way that the other characters would talk to him. You didn't really know who he was. And so again, I wanted to hear from him so the reader would know who he was as deeply as I did. So suddenly I was going back and adding his chapters. Now, in the end, the book is told from 8 perspectives. And at this point, I cannot imagine it being told from less. The idea that it was just the two guys, it would have been a much weaker book. But Sally was as I say, was a great breakthrough for me. I mean, in terms of feeling, she's the chapters that were the easiest for me to write. And because I can hear her so strongly. My dad was raised in the Midwest, and my grandmother was raised in the Midwest. And my grandmother was canned her own fruit and, cooked her own pies and was no nonsense. I'm sure there's the equivalent in Australia and America have so many overlapping cultural realities, because we're both large nations with lots of resources, lots of land. We're both nations that we're sort of, aside from we both have indigenous populations that were not treated very well. And we both have, everybody else came there from scratch and built themselves. And so I think we also share a certain personality. Always when you travel, I can tell when I'm, an Australian in seconds, and I hope they can tell the American too, because we're a little friendlier maybe than the French or the British aristocrats, or I don't know. I just think that we are. So, and you must have the equivalent of Sally's, which is these sort of very practical, people living in farms, tough lives, but at the same time, lots of vigor and lots of opinion. And in her case, she's very devoted to the church, but she's also as tough as nails, so wouldn't let the church push her around, and keeps house for her father, but has no patience with him. But she has, her wisdom is what makes her so much fun. Sort of the way that she looks at things and dissects people it just has great character to it. So she was a real pleasure to write. I mentioned, having gone to this weird speech about Australia and America, I read books with 3 friends, and we've been reading together for 16 years, and we read by projects. So we'll take a major author from somewhere in the world, doesn't have to be American, and we might read 7 books by them in a row over the course of 7 months. And we meet once a month over dinner and late into the night to talk about a novel every month. Sometimes it's themes. We'll take a series of 5 novels that are tied together by a theme or a moment in time, and we'll read those in sequence. But usually, our goal is to read high literature and talk about high literature. Our current project, which we launched last night, is we are reading 5 works of Patrick White.
Terrific.
And so we started with The Tree of Man. And last night was our first meeting to discuss Patrick White, where we discussed the Tree of Man at, over a period of 3 or 4 hours, and which was great fun. And by the way, like, having said that, I know there's a Sally in Australia, the mother in or the setup in Tree of Life is similar to the Midwestern lifestyle. These people who lived in relatively empty land where the weather was right on them. The floods came, the fires came, they got up at dawn to milk the cows. The men and women were silent for hours at a time, but were wise and flinty. They couldn't, they were not, they weren't generous with their emotions. They were generous of heart, but also had to be serious at all times. And that's the family, the husband and wife at the center of Tree of Man, and I recognize them. And yes, there's some of that in both Emmett and Sally, because I think we have a very similar kind of type of person who out in the Midwest who 100 years ago helped clear that land for the first time, under tough circumstances, and built those towns, and lived in solitude for the entire winter, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But boy, we love the Tree of Man. We cannot wait. We're doing Voss next, the book that came right after Tree of Man. We can't wait.
Yeah. So I'm glad you're reading them, and you're definitely right about there being Sallies in Australia. I think there might be 1 or 2 in my workplace even. Yeah, right. And this kind of tails neatly into another thing I wanted to ask, which is, what do you look for in reading a novel as something to bring joy? And because this book is bringing so much joy to my life.
As you're talking about now as a reader, or
as a reader,
when I'm a writer reading another book, I do. I appreciate the question. It is, writing is a craft, and so and I've been doing it since I was in first grade. And but when a young writer says to me, "What advice do you have?" my advice is always read, write, repeat, because that's it. You got to read something, you got to write something, and then go back to do it again. And you'll find someone you admire, or you're impressed by, or you're interested in as a reader, read their work carefully, and then go write something. And some, you could copy them as an example. I mean, that's a way of, there's nothing wrong in practice with copying or, working off of a template of another artist, because it's the way that you master yourself. All the great painters, whether the 19th century painters, the 20th century painters, whether it's Picasso or Matisse in the 20th century, or, Manet in the 19th century, they all were duplicating masters in their youth. They would stand in the Louvre or wherever, or in the Tate, and they would go and stand in front of a Rembrandt or a Renaissance painting, and they would copy it inch for inch, right? And that's the way you master craft, is you try to figure out, how did he do that? How did she do that? And so, as a young writer, there's nothing wrong with doing that, going back and forth from reading to writing. And so, yes, when I'm reading, even now, how did he or she do that is always, there's the impression the book gives me, and then a second later is that question. And so, you go through a sequence of great momentum in a book, and you're like, wow, that was awesome. It was thrilling. 40 pages went by like that. How did that? What happened there? How did they do that? Or you find yourself laughing or weeping or amazed or perplexed, whatever it is that you're going through. That's in a book that is well done by a talented writer. That is a part of what's intended at some level, whether unconsciously or unconsciously by the artist, but it merits sort of looking into it. And so, like last night, we talked a lot about, how is Patrick White doing this? And I don't know how well he's read in Australia today, but as an example, this book, The Tree of Man, spans a marriage from its beginning to the very end. I'm not giving anything really away there, because as soon as you're 100 pages in it, you can tell it's going to be the life of this couple from beginning to end. And that's not a big surprise. What's interesting is that you can go through 30 pages that describe a morning, and then you go through 3 pages which describe 13 years. And it's very fluid. And he does it without you even noticing. And the year of the time is never mentioned in the book once. But you kind of know where you are roughly by because you start with wagons, and then there's a car, the first car arrives, and then the farmer has a rundown car, and then the daughter has a fancy car, and you're kind of tracking the evolution of the 20th century through how they're driving, how they're getting from place to place, without, as I say, without it ever saying 1910 or 1920 or the date is never mentioned in the entire novel, which spans whatever it is, 50 years or something. And so that's that's a fascinating thing to look at, how he seamlessly shifts, not only how he strings it together, but also how he's constantly shifting the pace of the time, how it's unfolding. And as one of my friends put it last night, it's like being in a river where, the river narrows and you speed up, and then the river widens and you slow down, and then it happens again, and, it narrows and you speed up. And that's what happens in a river, right? Because the same amount of water is flowing through the river at any square inch along the length of the river. And the narrower it is, the faster it has to go. So anyway, the book feels like that, where the pace is changing in this seamless fashion. So as I said, I read with a pen. I ask myself questions. I try to understand how the book is working structurally, linguistically, the sentiments, the ideas, the imagery. I am pulling that apart like it's an autopsy. I guess.
I love that, and I love the analogy of the young master artist, in tutelage from the previous great painter. If you were a young Matisse looking on a Paul Cézanne or whatever it is, what were the books that inspired you as a young man?
I am 56, and I've been reading closely for almost about 40 years, really. So I have what's behind me is a teeny portion of my library, which is around here and in other rooms, enough to drive a spouse crazy, right? So, so I've loved, at different phases of my life, I've delved into different areas of literature and read them quite closely. Probably my three favorite novels are Moby Dick by Herman Melville, the great American masterpiece, 100 Years of Solitude by Marquez, and War and Peace by Tolstoy. Now, what those three things have in common, those three novels, is they all are big, spanning works.
Huge.
Yeah. And so obviously, part of the reason they are my favorite is because they do it all somehow, that they cover, they're enormous periods of time, not that, you feel like a lot of time goes by in Moby Dick. That's a relatively short term. 100 Years of Solitude is exactly 100 years. War and Peace is decades. But you're in the case of Moby Dick, you're covering ground, or water. But more than that, in each of those cases, the artist is bringing to bear so many different inventive ways to pursue storytelling within a single, very cohesive reading experience. That's what's just so impressive. The people feel alive. The language is great poetry in each case. History is being discussed and analyzed. Ideas are being shared. There's humor and pathos. They really do it all. But as I say, I love many, 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 many writers and many books. But those would definitely be benchmarks.
Hey, well, thank you very much for sharing your time and being so generous with me. One final question. What will you do next?
Something different.
Well said.
I do design for years. So whenever I'm about to start my new book, it's something that actually I've been working on for, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 years. So what I'm doing next, I won't start writing chapter 1 probably for 9 months. But it's something I've been thinking about for years. I've got notebooks on, and it will be very different than the 3 books I've written so far.
Well, we lie in wait. Amor Towles, thank you for being on the Booktopia podcast.
Thank you. I wish I was there in person, but thanks very much for listening.
The Lincoln Highway is published by Random House, and you can get it right now from booktopia.com.au.
Thank you for listening to the Booktopia podcast channel. Don't forget, you can subscribe to us on SoundCloud and iTunes for free and get access to hundreds of author discussions, book analysis pieces, and more. Or, if your eyes need a workout, head to Booktopia TV on YouTube. Don't forget, for all books featured in this podcast, and for access to a whole bunch of other fun content on our blog, head to Booktopia, Australia's local bookstore, at booktopia.com.au.